Well, folks, are you ready for Chapter 14? This one can be a bit confusing at times, and some of it will be terms that you have not seen before or recognized maybe, but surprisingly you've been exposed to them probably. The first learning objective talks about, defining what an assignment is and how it varies from a delegation of duty. An assignment is simply a transfer of contractual rights to another party. Probably has affected many of you already. For example, if you've purchased a home, for example, from Bank Iowa, and then all of a sudden the bills come from a different institution, some mortgage company, for example, that simply means that the bank has sold that right to receive money from you to somebody else. And that's called an assignment. The Bank Iowa would be the assignor in that instance, and then the assignee would be the mortgage company, and then you'd still be the obligor under that contract. Generally, all rights can be assigned unless, first off, there's the statute prohibits assignments. If the second one, if it's for personal services, for example, I have a contract for personal services to teach, and I could not certainly turn that over to somebody else to finish out my term without permission or acceptance by NICC. The third one is the assignment must not materially obligate the risk or duties. So a payment to Bank Iowa is certainly no different than making out the check to a mortgage company. So what I have to do is not materially changed. And then the contract itself prohibits the assignment, which sometimes they will do that. The difference between the assignment and a delegation refers to a delegation of duties, so you turn over the responsibility of a duty to somebody else. For example, I've already talked about, I can't transfer the duty of my teaching responsibility over to somebody else, but when I make an appointment to have my car serviced, and I make it, for example, with the owner of the service station, and the fact that he doesn't actually perform that duty for me doesn't really make any difference. He has an employee do it. So, as a general rule, any duty can be delegated unless the duty performs of the obligor involves personal skills or talents. The performance by a third party would vary materially from that expected by the obligee, and then the contract would prohibit delegation of duty. So let me give you a couple examples. First off, I've already talked about I can't delegate a teaching job. I certainly could not delegate a responsibility if I were a dentist, for example, to somebody else in the office, because the reason I go to that dentist is because that's the one I want. I don't expect to be transferred to somebody else. Let's say an example that one that would materially change the expectations or their duties. Let's say that I have LP and I've prepaid for like 1,000 gallons of LP, and then end up moving, and so I tell the person I bought it from, instead of delivering it to me, deliver it to the person that's bought my home, for example. That would not change anything, but what if I said instead, deliver it to my son, and by the way, he lives in Denver, Iowa, and not Lawler, Iowa. See, so that would make quite a difference, and you could not assign that delegation of duty. As a general rule, of course, any type of delegation can be assigned unless, as I said, those three elements. Okay, the third objective talks about the indicate. I'm going to start this one over. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 14. Let's begin with an example. I just bought a home. I mortgaged it through Bank Iowa, and lo and behold, 6 months down the road, my mortgage payments are no longer being made to Bank Iowa, but they're being made to, for example, Wells Fargo. So what's happened? Well, the first objective talks about an assignment, and it asks what's the difference between an assignment and a delegation. So an assignment simply was a transfer of contractual rights to a third party, and in this case it would have been from Bank Iowa to Wells Fargo. So Bank Iowa would be the assignor, the person making the assignment. The assignee would be Wells Fargo, and then me making the payments would be the obligor. Don't have much, there's not much I can do about it because obviously this must be within what generally happens. So generally all rights can be assigned unless, and your text gives 4 instances in which they are not. The first one says there's a statute that says no, you can't, this type of assignment is prohibited. If the contract were for personal services, making a payment to one bank versus another obviously is not personal services, but an appointment with a physician, and I go to my doctor and find out that my appointment's been transferred to another doctor, I would certainly have the right to refuse that. The assignment, number 3, the assignment will not materially alter the obligor's risk or duty. In this case, making a payment from one bank to another is no big deal. But what if, for example, I had purchased 1,000 gallons of LP, and I end up going on to natural gas, and so I simply tell the person that I bought it from, the company I bought it from, to deliver it to my neighbor instead. Well, that would not materially alter his obligation. But what if I said, well, deliver it to my son, and by the way, he lives in Denver, Iowa, which is 50 miles away. So obviously that I would not have that option. And then the contract itself, number 4, says the contract itself would prohibit such assignments, and generally they don't do that, but it can be. When an assignment made, generally speaking, the assignee is going to notify the obligor of that assignment. And if you think about why that would happen, I think it would all make sense to you. Otherwise, I would continue making my payments to Bank Iowa and not Wells Fargo. So what happens in that circumstance? And the text talks about it. The difference between an assignment and delegation of duties, a delegation of duty is where you transfer a duty to somebody else. So, for example, I have a teaching contract with NICC. I would not have the right to transfer that responsibility or duty to somebody else because of the type of contract it is. But what if I owned a gas station and you come in and you make an appointment with me to have your car serviced, and lo and behold, I end up having one of my employees do it? Does that make a difference? Don't think so. So as a general rule, any duty can be assigned unless the performance involves personal skills or talents, for example, teaching versus changing the oil in the car, a personal trust, and so forth. So delegating a duty to a babysitter to another person, obviously you can't do that. It would not be acceptable. The second one is a performance that by the third party would materially would vary materially that was expected of the obligee, and then the contract itself prohibits such delegation of duties. The third objective talks about the factors that indicate a third-party beneficiary or an intended third-party beneficiary. A prime example of this is an insurance policy. If I buy an insurance policy and name my wife as a beneficiary, she's the intended beneficiary, and when something happens to me, she would have the right to enforce that. Incidental beneficiary is somebody that simply because of a contract or made between two parties, and you may benefit it, even though you're not a party to it. That it just means incidentally you're lucky and you gain a benefit from it. But if something happens between the person that the contract was made for and myself, you could not step in and enforce that contract. The fourth objective is how are contracts discharged. Generally speaking, most contracts, people perform what they agree to do. When we get into the next chapter, we talk about a breach of contract. You get the impression that virtually is the most common way of ending contracts is through breach, and of course that's not the case. So people simply do what they say they would do. The text gets pretty specific. Besides performance, it can also be discharged by agreement, and that's really in 3 different sections. By rescission, you simply means I have a contract with somebody else, and we simply agree to cancel the contract. So that contract is discharged by agreement. Novation is the second one, and that's where parties simply substitute one contract for another one. And the third one kind of sounds similar, but that's called accord and satisfaction. Accord is where you change the terms of a contract, and satisfaction is where you carry them out. And of course, that's by agreement. So you change some of the terms, and maybe monthly payment. Now you're going to make it a weekly payment, for example, and you make those payments so you would have your satisfaction. There's also by operation of law, contract would be ended. The first one would be a material alteration, without the consent of both parties, the statute of limitations, a person waits too long, bankruptcy, the courts determined that the contract is discharged by bankruptcy, and possibility of performance basically means that under the circumstances nobody could fulfill the terms of the contract. And the last two are called commercial impracticability and frustration of purpose. Pretty similar. Impracticability means that something's happened unbeknown to either parties at the time the contract was made, and it just becomes virtually impossible because of the extreme change in costs and so forth. With frustration of purpose, there are some differences between the doctrines. Commercial impracticability involves an event that increases the cost or difficulty of performance in contract. In contrast, frustration of purpose typically involves an event that decreases the value of what the party receives in the contract itself. And finally, when is a breach considered material, and what effect does it have on the other party's obligation to perform? Well, a breach is material when it's substantial. In other words, whatever the person, when he breached a contract, the material was breached enough that there would maybe only very, very minimal performance. The other party is extremely dissatisfied. In that case, the other party is discharged from their performance, of course, can turn around, which you'll see in the next chapter, and sue for probably money. If the breach is minor, that means it's not material, then the duty to perform may be sometimes suspended until that breach is remedied, but the duty is not entirely excused, and then once that minor breach is corrected, then the non-breaching party must then resume responsibility of his contractual obligations. So a lot of material here, folks. I wish you luck with it, and keep studying and don't procrastinate. See you in Chapter 15.